Welcome, everyone. It is so good to have you here with us today. And it's my great privilege to welcome Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, George Lakey, and Desiree Kane. They're each going to introduce themselves. So my name is Marie Venner, and I'm with the DSA Religion and Socialism Working Group. And as you know, this session's on EcoSocialism. So our purpose this next hour and 15 is to gather some insight and have a dialogue about how we build the religious left to accomplish the key work in this eco-socialist space so that all may live and thrive. Probably everyone on this call knows about the Green New Deal, the Red Deal, that DSA has already endorsed, and now the upcoming Red, Black, Green New Deal that the Movement for Black Lives is coming out with in the next month. And their policies were some of the richest, them and the Poor People's Campaign over these last several years. All of these express the big change that's needed and so very overdue. So these align with the deepest values of our traditions. So what are the obstacles that keep our communities from showing up and helping accomplish these? What's worked, what hasn't, what needs to be called out? How can we help each other? What resources does socialism provide our traditions in building a religious left? How can we use that more effectively? How can we maybe begin to claim the term and call out capitalism at the same time, not requiring anything, to come first and in action, really. This session's really about action. So I will pass it now to Desiree, again, with great thanks for her coming. And after that, we'll go to Reverend Dr. Sadler. Thanks so much.
Mijuxis, Kani Oyashet Desiree Kane, Kani Lukum, Oregon. Welcome everyone. My name is Desiree Kane. I'm a Miwok 2 spirit that is living in the occupied territories of the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. I just wanted to take a moment to set the space and intention that we would be building together with care and compassion and a true sense of togetherness, because as we seek to build a future that is equitable and just for folks who live on this continent, whether documented, undocumented, indigenous, non-indigenous, all of those things, it requires a great deal of compassion, diplomacy, and care. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for bringing that kind of energy into this space. Thank you, Rodney, George, and Marie for joining me, as well as everyone who is a participant. I'll hand it off now to Rodney.
Well, thank you so much, Desiree. It's good to be with you all today. I'm grateful for this occasion. I want to let you know that I brought some special guests with me. I've got 3 of my students from my Bible and Justice class who have joined us, I believe, for this conversation. I wanted to start off, if I could, just taking a look at a few passages of scripture that just will ground what it is that I'm saying. And this, I want to lift up the point that this is the way that we think about relating to economics within the Christian tradition. From Acts chapter 2, verses 44 through 47, it says, "All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to the number of those who were being saved." And then finally, in Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through 37, it says, "And the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and with great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, For as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. There was a Levite, native of Cyprus, Joseph, to whom the apostles gave the name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. He sold a field that belonged to him, then brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. The reason I wanted to start with this conversation today is because I think that it raises an important point, that socialism, what we think about as a socialist paradigm, a pro-social communal orientation, is endemic to the essence of Christianity. You see this at the immediate aftermath of the presence of the Holy Spirit, the moment of Pentecost, the arrival or the birth of the church. The first thing that we see people doing is sharing their goods, is having things in common, is developing a new way of thinking about economics that differs from what the world says. And based upon this, all human need is eradicated. We eliminate issues like poverty and injustice and disparity because people are having things in common, they're living together with these things in common, and they're able to find a new way of supporting so that everyone has enough. I think that this is an important thing to lift up as we live in the midst of a capitalist world that is typically exploitative in the way that it treats people. It's exploitative towards the poor, i.e., it utilizes the poor as modes of producing capital. It's exploitative towards minoritized people. It utilizes them at a lower level in society in order to take advantage of them. Slavery was a mode of commodification of human beings in order to produce more capital. It also utilizes and exploits the land in a way to generate revenue, but often in ways that are harmful to the land itself. So the way that capitalism often works, in order to maximize capital, it minimalizes people, the poor, minorities, and the planet. It decimates them. As we're in the midst of these multiple crises, poverty, racial disparity, climate catastrophe, we need to find non-exploitive ways to save the planet and its people. So I offer the notion that we need a non-exploitive green movement. Well, what do you mean by that, Dr. Sadler? I'm glad you asked. In this paradigm, we need a movement that believes that every human being is inherently valuable, deserving of agency, and in the redemption of our imperiled planet. Everybody has a voice to work towards change. Number two, every human being has a role to play in this common work, for the planet belongs to no single type of color, creed, or type of people. Number three, the earth belongs equally to all of us, even those of us who are often overlooked and underserved. Number four, our efforts to save the planet can foster what I call a better world, featuring a new relationship between peoples and between people and the planet. And number five, poverty, deprivation, tyranny, and racial disparity are evils that we need to address in our collective work to reverse global climate change. I'm suggesting that we need to foster a paradigmatic shift. The paradigm shift that I'm talking about, I want to recommend a different kind of movement for this day based upon this notion of a paradigm shift. It is a fusion movement that brings people out of their organizing silos and supplements their work on particular interests with a collective work on targeted shifts in energy production. It is an inclusive movement that realizes that if we are to have victories, we must bring some of everyone to the table, particularly those who are minoritized communities that have been shut out of traditional climate change activism. It is a movement that values everyone's contribution, noting that we have a stake in the future of our planet and that it's everyone's responsibility to work for what I call a cleaner, greener, better world. And it is a holistic movement that seeks to bring an end to poverty, disenfranchisement, and racial disparity by harnessing the economic potential for shifting to a renewable energy grid. The goal is not just to foster a cleaner, greener, better world, but to do so by changing the way that we think. In part, the goals call for a reorientation of our values. Our current economic model is based upon a scarcity of resources, on limited supplies of carbon-based energy sources like coal, oil and natural gas. It's based on individual and corporate ownership of these limited resources, fostering an oligarchy of those who are empowered by their control of these resources, and an inevitable, ever-widening gap in wealth between the haves and have-not. Our current model is based on the necessity of disadvantaging those who are dependent upon those who own the resources for their survival. This limits personal freedom and subjugates human beings to the domination of those thereby economically disempowered. And it fosters a form of slavery to a system predicated on an addiction to oil and other carbon-based and corporate-owned commodities on which we live, or our economy thrives. And number four, it's based upon our taking resources from the earth violently, breaking it up, stripping it of its oil, coal, and natural gas. What I'm proposing is not just a gradual change in the source of our energy, but a reorientation to a new way of supplying clean, renewable energy to fuel a superior economic model. The new economic model is based on an abundance of resources supplied by God and our universe and available in creation, an endless supply of energy from the sun, wind, water, and earth's thermal energy that can supply all of our needs at a greatly reduced price. Our new model is based upon free access to these natural renewable energy resources by all people, and a model of collective ownership of the means of harnessing these energy resources. This will thereby democratize the process of energy production and foster greater wealth parity by freeing people from the tyranny of a few wealthy carbon energy producers. Number three, it's based on the advantaging of all people who are now empowered in a new way to share in the production of energy and the mutual ownership of its means of production. These people are now freed from the constraints of poverty, disenfranchisement, and racial disparity, liberated under this democratized economic energy production system. And number four, it's based on our freely receiving these resources given by our common creator and our world. There is no need to pierce the planet, pollute the air, poison the rivers, or in any other way to destroy our world in order to produce the energy that we require. I think that I've talked for a good amount of time, so let me turn it over to our next speaker. And if there are questions on what I've laid out, we can return to that later. So thank you all very much for your time today.
Oh, thank you. What a blessing, Reverend Dr. Sadler. And now we're turning to my really a mentor, George Lakey. He's been active in nonviolent direct action for 40 years and with mountaintop removal and other things. So go ahead, George.
Here we go. I unmuted myself. Is it working? Great. Thanks for the invitation, Marie, and thank you, Dr. Sadler, for the tremendous clarity with which you laid out the program, and I can hardly wait till we get to the questions about more of the permutations of that, but that was so clear. I'm speaking from Philadelphia, where I live on the occupied land of the Lenni Lenape people. And I'm excited to be a part of this panel because I have good news to share. And most places where I share this good news, it's a surprise to most people. And what's more traditionally in the gospel tradition than bringing good news, right? So this good news has to do with a mistake that I made, my biggest professional mistake. I was trained as a sociologist, and my biggest professional mistake in my entire career was made about a dozen years ago or so when I was noticing the polarization growing in our country. Sociologists have a kind of occupational habit of paying attention to how much coherence there is in any system, whether it's a family, small group, a big, country, whatever. We tend to be interested in how cohesive is it as compared with how much is it conflicted and divided, right? And so I was paying attention to that a dozen years ago, and I was very worried about the increasing polarization that I saw in the United States. And the reason why I was so concerned was I was thinking, well, if everybody's screaming at each other and nobody's listening, well, then how do we make forward progress, right? However, at the same time as I was doing that, I was doing research on the Nordic economic model, which was hugely influenced, as you know, by democratic socialism. And I was researching not only in order to write a book about how those systems work, that is how it is that those countries are at the top of the pile of all the international ratings for all kinds of things, shared prosperity, equality, individual freedom, democracy, you name it, they tend to be at the top. And I was researching that, but I also wanted to know, how did they get there? I was so curious about that. Writers about Scandinavia almost never tell us how they got there. And what's their secret sauce? 100 years ago, they were a mess. They were such a mess that they were hemorrhaging their own people who were fleeing those countries. Swedes coming right to the Midwest of US and Canada and so on. Norwegians were running away. People were getting out of town. And now, of course, the migration is very much in the other direction. So what's their secret? I was curious about that. So I had to look at the 20s and 30s, which is when they made their big leap forward. And what their leap forward was, that surprised me so much, was that they made it at the time of their greatest polarization in modern times. How could this be? This was direct contradiction to my view of polarization. They were making their big leap forward in progressive terms. And it really bothered me. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. So I thought, well, George, what some people do who believe in evidence, I would have flopped in the White House in the last term because I actually believe in the evidence. I thought, I better look at more evidence and see what's going on here. So I thought, well, what about my own country, the US, the 1930s? Tremendously polarized. Yes, the Nazis were marching in Norway, they were marching in Sweden, but they were marching in the United States. They filled Madison Square Garden with their rally. The Nazis were growing like crazy, and the Ku Klux Klan was going wild, of course, lynching, bombing, that kind of thing, a kind of specialty of the largest terrorist organization we've ever managed to build in our country. So all that was going on the right. And then on the left, it was the glory period of the American Communist Party. How polarized can you get, right? And people were, workers were occupying factories. There was all this drama going on. I wanted to know what was going on there with regard to progress. Well, of course, that's when we made the biggest leap forward that we were able to manage in the first half of the 20th century. That was our big moment. Okay, so now I'm even more bedazzled. So of course I fast forward to the 60s, which I personally, my first arrest was in a civil rights sit-in and so on. I was involved with Freedom Summer in Mississippi. I was on the training squad for the Mississippi Freedom Summer and so on. So I was very involved in the 60s. Well, I remember very well how polarized it was. The American Nazi Party came back. Welcome back, right? Ku Klux Klan again, bombing churches in Mississippi, all that was going on. And at the same time, we had a phenomenal blooming of the left again, including the crazy left, the Syndicalese Liberation Army, some of you will have heard of in California, right? We had this incredible polarization, tremendous lot of bombing and violence going on. And the 60s, which of course, flowed over into the 70s, was the greatest period of progress that we made in the second half of the 20th century. Okay, so I'm going nuts because I don't like to have my convictions contradicted. I don't really want to change my mind. I don't know, maybe folks out there love to change their minds about things that are important to them, but I did not want to change my mind. And yet, by that time, the book was out. The Viking economics book. So I was on book tour and I was running around Britain and a number of countries, but in Britain, in Glasgow, Scotland, I happened to be put up for hospitality because I prefer staying with families rather than hotels. I was being put up by an artist named John Creed, a Quaker, who had changed his art form to metal sculpture. And I was wandering around his house looking at these gorgeous metal sculptures. And I was just mind blown. And I turned to him and I said, John, how can you do this with metal? Metal is stubborn. It doesn't want to do what you want to do with it. How do you get it to do this stuff you're doing? And he said, oh, George, let me show you, right? So he takes me out through the kitchen in the back of the house, out into the yard. That's where his studio is, opens the door and proudly presents me to the blacksmith's hearth. And he's got a forge there. He's got a forge. He said, yeah, I apprenticed to a blacksmith to find out how to work with metal, because you're right, metal doesn't want to do what you want it to do. And so you have to make it soft. You have to make it malleable to be able to do what you want to do. And I said, John, you've helped me so much tonight. What polarization is a forge. It's a blacksmith's forge. What it does in any society is it heats up the system, and it makes norms melt, right? And it makes institutions mushy. We see that in our country today. And all that is going on because polarization is this giant forge. Okay, well, what do we know about forges? One thing we know about forges is that a forge doesn't have an opinion about what you make with the metal. You could make shoes for horses. Horseshoes are made on forges, right? You can make gorgeous art like John Creed does. You can make junk, which is what I would do. A forge doesn't care. It just does its thing, which is to heat up the metal. Well, that's how polarization is. Polarization doesn't care what the result is. It just heats up society. And so in Scandinavia, it heated up those societies. Very smart social movements took advantage of the heat and transformed their societies to be able to create the social democratic societies that they've got today. Now, at the very same time, in Germany and Italy, of course, also heated up like crazy, incredible polarization, right? Communists fighting, duking it out on the streets with fascists, with the Nazis in Germany's case. And what we, of course, got as a result in Germany was Hitler and Mussolini in Italy, because the force doesn't care. It just heats up society. It's up to the movements, the social movements, just like it is to the blacksmith, just like it is to John Creed, to take advantage of that moment. And that is my good news. My good news is that we're more polarized than we've ever been in my lifetime. I'm 83 years old. We're more polarized than we've ever been in my lifetime, which means heat is more intense than it's been. There's more opportunity for change, especially if you have a vision like Dr. Sadler does, like the SA brings, right? Especially if you bring a smart and sensible and grounded and spiritually grounded vision to the table, which is what the Scandinavians did. They brought, and not only that, they brought a vision that was not only grounded empirically, there were economists in on it, helping people figure out how to make the people's well-being number one instead of capital number one, right? That's what they were doing. They were doing it intellectually, but they were also doing it in common sense terms. And so they could go to all the people who were being heated up in their consciousness by polarization, just as is happening in our country, and the tremendous, appeal of the right, the more Nazis were growing and so on. So they went to people and they said, look, would it be valuable for your family to have healthcare available to all without having to lay out money for it? Maybe you don't have so much money that you've got for medical care, but you will get medical care anyway if you buy our vision. And so on issue after issue after issue that were bread and butter issues, or really, really vital issues for people. It could be said to them, hey, look, we've got this vision that would speak to your concern. And that's what did it. I'm a deeply spiritual person. I'm a Quaker, but I was brought up an evangelical, which is a very spirit-focused kind of outfit, revival services and that kind of thing. That I like a good revival service once in a while. And the thing about Spirit is that what it does is it sharpens the perception of people. It enables us to see stuff that ordinarily we wouldn't see. We would just go with fashion, or we'd go with either fashion, we're very popular to go with fashion, or just go with our gut, instead of going with our hearts, which is what my hand on its own accord keeps wanting to point to. We could go to our hearts, right? We could see through the mess to the opportunity that's underneath. And that's one of the things that I think religion brings to the table with regard to this amazing thing that we're going through in our country. It brings a perceptiveness that enables us to see the possibility of God's work in the middle of the agony and the pain that goes with polarization. Next year, there will be more violence than there is this year. Next year, there will be more suicides than there are this year, and so on, because the deck is stacked, in my view, toward more and more polarization in the years to come. That, to someone who can perceive it, means more and more opportunity. And it also invites us to get into that communitarian relationship that Dr. Sadler refers to. That relationship with people. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be fully communitarian. I've done that too, but close enough to experience the bonds, which will assist us to keep steady in the midst of the heat that we're experiencing and will experience more. And so I believe that religion brings to the table models of perception and models of closeness that can make the difference for us to use our talents fully in bringing about the healthy social movements that will act as the blacksmith working at the forge. Thank you.
Thanks so much, George. And it's my great privilege again to introduce Desiree Kane, who is, I'm actually going to ask her to do that because she's going to do a better, do justice to it better than I will. But I met Desiree through the Poor People's Campaign, and have great respect for her work in the Indigenous community as well. And of course, the original communitarian life and examples, and continue to be in among the Indigenous communities who are leading us in so many ways. So Desiree, thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Gosh, how do I even follow Dr. Sadler and George Lakey? Thank you for your words, both of you. I really appreciated the analogy of polarity being a forge of fire where new ways can be melded as we work together on the opportunity that has presented itself in this moment. I really appreciated listening to you talk about the rise of fascism and what has happened throughout history, because today our opportunity is a bit different. With rising polarity and the addition of things like AI, artificial intelligence, social media, weaponized technology, weaponized government-grade propaganda, the challenges for activists are so many. So when I think about how can we be building the religious left, I think about religion and religious spaces being preyed upon by authoritarian folks who don't want to work in a communal manner. They have dressed themselves in the outfits of spiritual people and are beginning to prey on the prayerful, and have been for a number of years, but highly augmented since technology has been put into this mix. Doomsday cults, all manner of things are starting to stem from the space in a way that are costing lives through dangerous disinformation campaigns that go against many of the values that are presented by many of the world's religions that are loving, right? So things have been all mixed up. And I wonder, what can we do each day to answer this big thing that we're facing? And one of the things that I know, so in my day job, I'm an investigative journalist. I'm also at the helm of a 500-person startup that began just at the end of the year and then ballooned, that combats dangerous disinformation that is costing lives. And many of the things that we work on are about educating people on things like the doctrine of discovery and how to move away from authoritarian situations and regain control, because our relationship with our creator, no matter which creator or creators one may believe or not believe in, it always resides within ourself and our relationship. So the doctrine of discovery is a very brief thing I'll touch on. That is a papal bull from 1491 that basically said if when Columbus and his men came and landed, lost at sea in the territories of the Carib, Arawak, Taino nations, it said that if someone was not Christian, that they were therefore savage, and that this was virgin land for the taking for the church, and it enabled the genocide that happened here. So looking at that and understanding, even as recently as 2005, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg upheld this. There needs to be a major focus on what are these deep underpinnings that are reinforcing the authoritarian control placed upon all people who live here by a very select few, by those 2,100 or so global billionaires that have made resource colonies out of every inch of land we've got on this planet. Another thing we can do is to have hard conversations with our families. Some families, hard conversations can look so different, but in this moment of polarization and radicalization, there's righteous anger that's happening. But the way to reach someone who's being radicalized by dangerous groups or militias, white supremacists, and it does impact communities of color too, who folks can internalize some of those things, but really people with settler heritage, there needs to be a great deal of focus there from DSA. Democratically socialism is a difficult thing to bring into your home. But with that righteous anger, people are saying, you're stupid, instead of saying, I miss you. And that moment is radicalizing people so much. So answering that, going to your relatives and saying, reminding them of who they were before Trump. Even that moment, to remind them who they were before the AI, before the technology, before social media and a pandemic that radicalized people because everyone was online. Who was it? Who was that person? And let them know that you missed them. Another thing that we can do is to truly understand the threat that the religious left is under. I don't think that that's lost on anyone here, that there has been the narrative of especially the Christian left has been totally taken and twisted into something that Christianity is not at the root about, and put into a political place that is very dangerous for a lot of people. So understanding the threats, being compassionate, all of these things, They do go back to regaining our locus of control and holding our own relationship with ourselves and our external environment in a caring manner, because everything we do goes outward and outward. So starting with ourselves, being kind with ourselves, and then being kind and compassionate outwardly. So I don't have a lot to offer beyond that, but I do have some reading materials and things that you could watch to better understand the threat. The first would be a documentary called The Social Dilemma. And The Social Dilemma does a very good job to explain how social media is participating in polarization. How is this even happening? If people aren't talking to one another and they're in quarantine, how are we being polarized? The platforms in the government are required, in my opinion, to build guardrails. So that's one. Another amazing book is Lisa Fithian, Shut It Down, Stories from a Fierce and Loving Resistance. You'll find some of my photography in here. I was honestly very lucky and blessed to have Lisa in my life during my time at Standing Rock. Everything in there that she teaches is so just thoughtful. And for it to be from someone from settler heritage, it's really a gift. And the final one is called The Cult of Trump. It's by a cult exit expert named Dr. Stephen Hassan, who fell into a cult 45 years ago and has spent his time since he left a dangerous cult where he was one of the people polarized in a bad way. He was in an accident, he came out of it, and has dedicated the rest of his life to make sure that no one else falls into authoritarian cults that do mind control, brainwashing, I mean, all of these kinds of things. So he's at a place called the Freedom of Mind Resource Center, and he speaks to all manner of groups. I have just also, same as Lisa, found his contributions to be substantial and coming from a real place of love. He's a Jewish man, he's very devout, and so he has a really good Judeo-Christian frame to what he's talking about, especially as we look forward. We've got 4 years, we've got an ally in office, so now is the time to push hard, because we are more likely to advance when we have a more friendly administration. Trump's genocide is real and ongoing. So right now with this Biden administration, it's go time. There were a number of activists. We all kind of chilled out in advance, didn't take on election work and things like that, because we knew as soon as this administration came in, we are going to have to be ready and be honestly insistent and relentless and dedicated to our people. I like to make advances on things when we're able to make big advances. And so we have an opportunity right now to do that. So I'll just close with that. Thank you so much for listening to me and for having me join.
Oh, thank you so much, Desiree. I didn't know that we had Lisa Fithian in common. So what a nice fun. Gosh, what a perfect handoff too. One of the things that struck me the most a year or two back was hearing breathe and push. You know, to breathe and push. And also it jumped out to me when Gus Speth said, you know, he's also George's age, you know, he said, this has been, you know, he's observed 40 years of this, 50 years, and now we need to push harder than ever because, you know, we've got these openings now, you know, we may be tired or discouraged, you know, but actually now is the time to, you know, be in and pushing, you know, pushing harder than ever. I see that we have 9, you know, questions to start, and I, you know, was flexible about having, you know, a presentation and something. I'll just speak very briefly as a Catholic and a socialist. one of the things that I really draw on in my tradition is the concept of universal destination of goods. So that everything in and of the earth is universal, should be universally shared. Anything about private property being okay, it comes way after that. So that, to me, this is a gigantic, capitalism is a gigantic violation of this. So in addition to having and Desiree, I'm also grateful to you for bringing in the Jewish tradition as well, which is, otherwise not present on our panel today. But, the prophetic tradition there is so meaningful to me. And in so many others. My husband, who's also here this morning, was remarking that, how many traditions are courageous enough to include in their holy book those who spoke out so forcefully in challenging, the central leaders in path and power sectors that we're on. And as Reverend Dr. Sadler brought up, Christians were growing the strongest, and they were inspiring the most people, perhaps most likely. At the time, they were the most countercultural and in sharing everything in common. And, I recall in my own religious tradition, the saints, to me, they are people who challenge the system. They were often marginalized. They were not accepted generally in their time, but, revered and lifted up later as, hey, those folks were on the right path. They had the right idea. We're at least course correcting enough to lift them up. But, the Catholic tradition, I would say, feels like it has the furthest to go of any tradition at this point. So especially in the US, we're really at a low point. And still challenging the system, but the institutional church is as many have heard. So let's go ahead and start with these 9 questions that we have, at least to kick off. And then if there is time, I have more that I can share. So the first question, thank you, Joseph Ferreira, is any ideas of how to appeal eco-socialist spirituality to mainstream religious people, evangelicals, who've at all, who have historically chosen to side with fascists over socialists? Reverend Dr. Sadler, can you start us off with that?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's sort of the question of the day. How do we bring those who should be on board with this effort based upon the theologies that they hold into the fray? I think there's got to be some significant work that's done with a different hermeneutic, i.e. a different way of reading scripture and helping people to appropriate that. One of the things I'll say is that I remember years ago, Dr. William Barber, talking about going to present at a meeting in, I think it was somewhere in the middle of the country, Indiana somewhere. And he went to speak before a group of conservative pastors. And he had a very progressive agenda that he was trying to bring out. And he was about to start his speech. And then he looked at the crowd and he said, I'm going to miss them if I just start with this. So what he did was he picked up his Bible and he went through and just started reading through a few texts that dealt with issues of larger issues of justice. And then he talked about it in terms of the context, its original context. And this is what was going on at the time. And then by the time he'd finished sort of working through that, he started hearing people say, amen, amen, amen. They were getting on board. And then he slipped into what he was trying to talk about and got back to his thing. Mm-hmm. And he realized that by coming together with the commonplace of scripture and helping people to find value in that. They were able to get on board in a way that if you just sort of gone in there and presented his ideas initially, they may not have. So I think resurfacing our commonplace, i.e. scripture, and then utilizing it in a way that really does bring clarity to its original context and what it meant then, and then helping people to utilize the love that they naturally have for it to get behind a larger vision of progressive social change might be the best way I know to do that.
Thanks. George, can you chime in too?
Oh, I totally support that. I think I love the example of being able to use a text because that's a common area but there's so many points at which we converge, right? Like I'm very excited about the Medicare for All vision myself, because I think about all those families where people voted for Trump who have medical issues. And especially so much of the rural part of our country is drawn to the right wing of the Republicans, and yet rural hospitals are closing like crazy, and it's hard to have a baby if you're not having a smooth birth, because you're so far away from the hospital. That kind of thing is going on. So there are a number of common areas, I think, that we can find that are easy to talk with, and that people are delighted to talk with you about, and then move from there to, well, how about we get a system that enables you to be taken care of.
Okay, this next question, we're going to have to keep starting with Reverend Dr. Sadler. And Desiree, please just jump in if you want. So the question from Evelyn Hooper is, any suggestions for talking to Christians who see the new heaven and new earth as something separate from current creation? And, I think of John Dominic Crossan here and how helpful it was for me to just, and from the Jewish tradition, to focus on the earth and people here and now, hoping you can help us with this.
Well, thank you, Evelyn, for that question. Evelyn's one of my students who's here with us today. I'm grateful for the question. I think one of the things that I'm attracted to is that passage. I think it's Revelation chapter 20, when it talks about this. And I remember preaching a few sermons a few years ago where I tried to utilize this passage in the context of climate and environmental justice. And my point was this: if we're careful to attend to the point of this text, a new heaven and new earth are not somewhere else. God is not lifting us up somewhere to take us off somewhere in space or somewhere in some other plane. God is, according to this passage, coming back here and renewing what we have here. And if this is the point, if this is the vision that, and I'd say that there are multiple visions of what takes place after death. These are metaphors, so they can be multiple ones, but they're trying to express something greater. But if this Johannine vision of what takes place on earth is the one that dominates this trajectory, then maybe we need to value the earth more. Maybe we need to care for that which will be God's home. If God's coming back here to call this home, maybe we need to take better care of what will be not just our home, but God's home or later on as well. I was talking to my class today about the two basic trajectories in the Bible as to why humans are important. One of them is because of their relationship to God. You're created B'Tselem in the image of God, and others is because you're to love other human beings as you love yourself. But in this one, we love the planet because of its relationship to God. If God is coming back here and God is going to call this home, then we should value this as God does. We should value making sure that God is coming back to some place that is as best prepared and as least profane as possible.
It's notable that the younger evangelicals poll much more concerned about climate than the older evangelicals do. So it's a mistake to think there's a monolith over there.
Desiree, do you want to add anything?
Well, my observation is that there's a whole conversation that's also happening not in that particular religious space, but in others, that is about returning humanity back to within the natural order, because capitalism has taken us out of the natural order. And it very much feels like the same lesson in a different context.
Thank you. So Mark Ribolid is asking, I work as a chaplain in hospice care, lots of support in processing grief. Is there a place for grieving ecological breakdown that will clear emotional space for greater clarity of action? Desiree, do you want to start us on this one?
There's always space for clearing grief and for holding that space within ourselves and for others to grieve. The goal should be, to be able to navigate these systems that are oppressive and hurtful without becoming harmed in the process. So any of those soft spaces where we're interacting with part of the natural process of death, whether it be ecological death, death of one of our relations, there's always space to be held for and with other people. We are witnessing multiple genocides happening before our eyes. It's not just human genocide, it is genocide upon the planet that's occurring. So to feel a sense that people might want to mourn that is very understandable. This technologically savvy world where we've got a lot of artificial things going on. In my circle, we are talking about things like biophobia and fear of the natural world. And so when people, I believe, are grieving ecological devastation, from our natural world with technology. So any bridge work that can happen to make that easier in the face of collapse is wonderful caring work.
Great. George, you want to add?
My family can tell you that I can be seen crying over the morning newspaper as I eat my cereal. So it's awfully good to, in my experience, for us to cry, and then tell people that we do. I very often can work that into my presentations, tell people about my crying, and because people just so badly need permission, right? I'm really glad, Desiree, for what you said, because people so need permission to go ahead and cry. It is very, very sad. There's a lot of sadness that's not expressed, and then people try to toughen up instead of staying soft.
Yeah. If I could just jump in here,
Yes.
One of the things I might say is that lament, I think, is necessary work. Lamentation is necessary work before we can move towards anything else. I think there's a moment, and this is perhaps a moment where we should be in the midst of lamentation, lamenting the way that we've allowed our planet to fall into disrepair, to be abused in the way that it's been. And we're all, I know that we like to point our fingers at Duke Energy, we like to point our fingers at Exxon Mobil, we like to point our fingers, but we all participate in that. So we need to lament our corporate responsibility for fostering the world where it is today. But that lamentation should open our eyes so that we can move towards confession, and we can confess, yes, this is how we're complicit. These are the things that we've done. This is what we've done to take advantage of our planet, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm hoping that that confession won't just be a moment in vain, but that confession will lead to atonement. When we can begin to say, these are the things that we might do to repair the breach that has been caused. These are the things that we might be able to do to reconcile ourselves and our planet once more. These are the things we might do to begin to move towards that next level. And that next level is true healing. That next level is true restoration. And hopefully we can get to that. But I don't know that we're able to get to that unless we first go through that lamentation process.
I very much view the red, black, and green deal as part of that atonement process. And arguably, I believe it's part of a truth and reconciliation process that isn't named yet, but that is what we're doing. the revisionist history around what has happened with Indigenous people has been famously, at least amongst Indigenous folks, hurtful. And so this moment, I so appreciate that, Reverend Sadler, because lamentation and looking at oneself, whether as a body of humanity or individually, and acknowledging that we have capacity to harm, but we can choose in this moment to acknowledge what we're doing and then stop, apologize, and then not do it, because the best apology is changed behavior.
Right.
That is the opportunity we're afforded every single day. So if we want to get to a true place of healing, especially centering Indigenous people, folks whose relatives were stolen off of Africa and brought here forcibly, all of those things, they have to just be able to be plainly said. And honestly, so even myself, I am both the colonizer and the colonized. And there needs to be a real conversation where we can look one another in the face and say, listen, I'm an Indigenous person, I'm tribally affiliated, but also if you go back, I had relatives that were slave owners. And just be able to say it and not hide it, because there is a proudness in being able to say, listen, that was then, I am different. That is not what we're doing today or any day, as long as I am here. But that true, like, look at ourselves has been something that we have not been able to do because of the forces of settler colonialism and capitalism so long. So that sort of like just honest conversation, so we can view one another as whole people without lies. It's very healing. It's very, very healing. So I look forward to what can come from that.
How do we promote that? How do we promote that more in our religious communities?
If I could say one thing, I think might tie into this. I was just going to raise the point that we have a culture, particularly a religious culture, and maybe more so the evangelical dimensions of our religious culture, and not to insult or put them down, that has been disproportionately focused on praise. We do a whole lot of praise and praise. But the interesting thing is, if you ever look at the Abrahamic traditions, you look at the Psalter, the Psalms, and one of the things that you find is that so many of our Psalms, I believe the majority of them, are Psalms of lamentation. And the interesting thing is that it's the lamentation that gives way to the praise at the end. So if we are just sort of following that basic pattern, we might find good space initially to lament, and then allow that lamentation to naturally lead us back towards that praise in the end.
Thank you so much. George, do you want to add?
Well, I'd like to link that to your question about how can we get our religious folks that we're connected to experience that more fully. And I'm a great, I've had very positive experience from creating a campaign organization that actually uses nonviolent direct action, that is, uses confrontation, but in a way that is not only nonviolent, but really brings spirit to the confrontation. And what it seems to do when we, for example, the group I started in 2010 is called Earthquaker Action Team. And we took on the bank, the biggest bank that was financing mountaintop removal coal mining, which was PNC Bank. It's regional, it's not national, but it covers a good many states. And so it's the 7th largest bank in the country. So we started in my living room. So we were this very tiny group, taking on the 7th largest bank in the country. But that's what socialists sometimes do, right? So that's what we were doing. And it was because Quaker was even in our name. We decided to take the chance, and we got a lot of, questionable feedback on that about why are you taking our name and doing, getting arrested with it all the time. But in the thing that when people actually would bring, we would get them there to at least be observers of this process, what they would see was that sometimes we would drop into prayer in the midst I remember, for example, the tallest building in Pittsburgh, which is the headquarters city of the bank, where we did a major confrontation in the lobby. The lobby filled up with lots of people from the skyscraper who were coming down to watch this and so on and so on. And at one point, the police were surrounding us and they were just about ready to arrest. And one of our number decided it was time to call for prayer. So we go into prayer, right? And next thing you know, we are crying, and it's partly the the connections, the deep connections we made with Appalachia, where the mountains have been blown up and people have been dying, actually, and so we were. Our hearts were full of that. We were holding posters of photographs showing what it was like in the destruction of these mountains. I mean, it was so graphic, right? We're bringing that into the bank lobby and showing that to this big crowd. But then at that point, when the guy, Michael said, and now it's time for prayer, and we go into prayer, a bunch of us were bursting into tears. It was just so heartfelt and so intense. And so the people present were deeply moved. And I noticed I was able to get my own eyes clear enough to be able to look out to this. I don't know, there were hundreds of people in the lobby by then. And some of them were crying. And I thought, this is Pentecost Sunday. I mean, this is, to use a New Testament reference. It was like, this is the Spirit in motion, and who cannot be moved at a time like this? So, and that was transformational for the people, for the Quakers that we had been able to get to participate in that. This is it. This is it. And I think that's one way to relate to our co-religionists, is to develop enough of their trust in us so that they will come along and see, at least from the sidelines, what's going on. And maybe then the next time actually participate, go to jail with us, and so on. And I'd experienced that as a youngster through the civil rights movement. My first time to jail, I was totally terrified, but somebody was kind to me, and my cellmate, it's all right, George. Your life will not be destroyed by this, and so on and so on. And obviously, 60 years later, I'm still at it. So it's, that's what I would suggest. That kind of both building relationship and bringing people into confrontation. It's, after all, we're not going to push the economic elite aside, which is what the Nordics did. They pushed them out of power, out of their dominance, out of their dominant position. That's how they freed themselves up to create what they've created. We have to do that with our economic elite. We have to push them out of the way, but we're not going to do that by not being confrontive.
Right.
It was a very similar story that I could share from Standing Rock, because that spiritual piece was such a foundation to everything that we did and as community do. On Black Friday, the largest shopping day of the year for Christmas, we went to the mall to pray for the water together. And it was one of those moments where the police had encircled and everybody in the mall was around our 40-something people. And, it's like RoboCops, where they got their, just all decked out, getting ready to attack a group of unarmed people. It was a very violent thing. And actually, Lisa was arrested that day pretty aggressively. In that moment, someone just said, we're here to pray for the water. And we just kept saying, we're here to pray for the water. And it was just, we had police officers that were crying. We had people in the shops. There was not a dry eye, because people could understand that the religious freedom of everyone was being so violated in that moment. And not just that, when you're there to pray for something and you are persecuted, that is a very, it's a thing that a lot of people can understand and say, that's not what we're doing anymore. We're not going to do that. We are going to pray for the water and for each other. And those moments, you can see some, Lisa outlines it in her book about the roles of allies in that moment, when Indigenous people would show up at Actions to hold a prayer ceremony for the land, for the water, for each other, for our spirits, for our ancestors, for our lost languages, all of these things. The Allies were organized a little ways back to perform like a protective perimeter.
Mhm.
In a very true sense, using their mostly white privilege to make sure that those ceremonies were safe. And when there were armed gunmen, we had a truck rammed through the crowd. Those ceremonies didn't stop. You know, not everyone can throw their bodies into the gears of oppression like that. Some people's bodies are already in gears of oppression.
Mhm.
But if you have those privileges and you are able to move in that way and protect prayer of Indigenous people, protect the prayer of Black folks, protect the prayer of Asian people, protect prayer, we are able to move mountains like together. Those accessible moments are very salient, very powerful.
Reverend Dr. Sadler, do you want to add? One of the things I'm hearing here is moving and being willing to pray together in the streets, right? So prayer has been so privatized in so many ways, you know, through the neoliberal period. And of course we do it together, you know, in our churches, but you know, that it's a structured and limited way. But and I'm also hearing, and all of this reflects my experience of how action that, you know, for instance, the actions that we've taken in front of Excel out here, our large utility monopoly, very extractivist in multiple ways, especially in terms of the money it takes out of our state. In you know, largest GHG emitter, largest lobbyist, magnificent greenwasher. But that in-person work, you know, in the street, even during COVID, it turned out to be one of the richest things we've done this last year. You know, we had about 60 days of continuous action, you know, noon daily. So that does seem to be such a gift in terms of movement building, to just that simple showing up and having the experience. And of course, Black Lives Matter, right? The biggest thing going in this area the last year, and it has just really brought so many people to the table, and in Standing Rock before that. So anyway, Dr. Rodney.
Certainly, I mean, I think praying together is definitely powerful. I'll briefly try to give you two stories. One of them was the second week of the Moral Monday movement, when we were just getting this started. I remember we were being arrested, and we were all standing together praying in front of the General Assembly building. And I remember I started praying, and the police started coming to arrest us. And as they came out, I was down on my knees and I was praying. And as I stand up, as I finally open my eyes and stand up, I see the chief of the General Assembly Police waiting to arrest me. But he is stopped because his own faith motivated him. And he felt that connection to us in the moment. He, you know, may not have agreed with our larger issue, but he did agree that if we're standing there praying, we have a connection. As I stood up and he prepared to arrest me, I opened my arms and we embraced. And in the midst of this moment, literally, and then he, you know, I stepped back and let him cuff me, and then he took me away. We developed a relationship throughout the rest of, I mean, I think the next several years of Moral Monday. I would go check in with him, he'd come check out. We developed a relationship because of the power of prayer in that moment. Another moment I want to talk about was one day during I think this was the uprising back in 2015 in Charlotte, in the aftermath of the killing of Jonathan Ferrell. And the police were in the streets, and they were preparing to attack protesters one night. Protesters had gotten tired of this, and they decided, we're just going to brace and take the attack. And they put on gas masks or masks with vinegar and things like that. And they were getting ready to absorb the attack. And the police were there. And this was a late night, so many of my colleagues, my religious colleagues, had gone. So there were only 3 of us left as clergy. So we did everything we could. The police were standing in a line. We went up to the police and talked to each of them. We're like, it's early Sunday morning. We know that some of you want to be in church today. Why don't you just give these people peace? Don't attack them. Don't hurt them. We talked to each and every person up and down the line, challenged them to remember their own faith commitments. And then when we went back and forth and talked to people, it looked like the troops were inevitably going to march and the people were inevitably going to confront them. There's going to be violent. We finally just broke down in the middle of the street, the 3 of us, and just started praying as hard as we possibly could in the middle of the street. And as we prayed, we reached out and we touched hands. And as we're standing there, we started to feel hands touching us on the shoulder and hands in front of us. And then we felt people in front of us. I was like, oh, the cops advance on us. And then we realized that other people had sort of come around, camera people, and then other people. And then by the time we'd like stopped praying, we opened our eyes and looked. And we were surrounded by this group of people. Some had left the protesters, others had come from the sidelines, and others were reporters who were there praying with us, reporters praying with us. And then as we stood up, we looked, and the line started to break, and they started to fall off. And as they fell back, they retreated, and they took their batons and their shields, and they walked away. And I was just like, we just looked at each other. We're like, praise God. There's nothing we could do. We had broken down, but we turned to it. We fell on our knees and prayed, and God gave the answer in that moment. So
Wow.
Corporate prayer is a wonderful thing in the midst of these moments of protest and resistance.
Amen. I come from a tradition where corporate prayer is the main prayer. So we just have a few minutes left. So maybe each of you 3 wonderful people could either offer a blessing to those here in EcoSocialists or some final words. Do you want to start?
I'd like to say, never discount the power of your own example. That if you go to your edge, if you take the risk of going to your edge, I'm so moved by that story I've just heard from you, Rodney Sadler. If you go to your edge, others will see you, and they will be moved by that. And it may not be as dramatic as touching your shoulder at that moment. It may be in other ways. They'll say, well, I saw that, I could do this. And there will never be a way around the power of example. Some of us have to move. And why shouldn't it be all the people on this call?
Yeah. Desiree,
Oh, sure. I just want to just say thank you. It's not really in my tradition to do any sorts of blessings. So I would just like to give my closing minutes time to Reverend Dr. Sadler, please.
thank you.
Well, thank you, Desiree. It's been wonderful to be on this panel, Marie. Thank you so much for this. Desiree, thank you for your wonderful insight. George, I just want to say, I'm from Philadelphia too. And actually, I'm a graduate of Morristown Friends School. So
What?
I went to a Quaker college also.
That's excellent. So there's a lot of Quaker in this moment. As we leave today, let me just say that the God who has been with us throughout all times, the God who stands by us in our most difficult moments, the God who, in my tradition, brought Jesus again from the dead, resurrected one who was lost, gave a victory after it seemed as though all hope was lost, is with us now, and will continue to bring us forth and continue to work in miraculous ways. If we stay faithful, we will certainly find that we have a partner in God. If we are willing to be, as King said, co-workers with God, we will see God bring us faithfully through to the end. So hold on. Don't give up. I don't believe God brought us thus far to leave us. Amen.
Thank you all. Thank you all
Amen.
for coming. Thank you to Dr. Sadler, Dr.
Amen.
Lakey, Desiree. It's really been a blessing. And everyone else, I'm so sorry we didn't get through the end of the questions. I'll see if I can get those to the panelists so we have a further feedback. And hopefully the tech support person can help us save those in the chat. Thanks again, everyone. Feel free to be in touch. Bye.
Thank you, Marie.
God bless.
God bless.
All right.